In the dusty frontier town of Dustcreek Hollow, where children grew up wild and forgotten, one woman arrived with nothing but a worn Bible and a heart full of hope. Miss Lila Fern, heavy with child and carrying secrets from her past, found herself in a place where education was as scarce as rain. With no schoolhouse in sight, she gathered the town's barefoot children in an old barn, teaching them letters with chalk scraps and turning lullabies into lessons. Her gentle spirit began to transform young lives, one story at a time. From his vast ranch overlooking the valley, Silas Everhart watched this remarkable woman with growing fascination. The wealthy, reclusive rancher had built walls around his heart after losing his wife, but something about Lila's selfless devotion stirred feelings he thought were buried forever. But what happens when a woman's golden soul meets a man's guarded heart in the unforgiving frontier?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wagon wheels had long since stopped creaking when Lila Fern first laid eyes on Dustcreek Hollow. What greeted her wasn't the promise of a fresh start she'd prayed for during those long, bone-rattling miles across the territory, but rather a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten dreams. A town squatted in a shallow valley like a discarded toy, its main street little more than a dirt path, flanked by structures that had seen better decades. Lila pressed her hand to her rounded belly, feeling the child within shift restlessly, as if sensing her uncertainty. 6 months along now, and showing more each day. The stagecoach driver had deposited her trunk with the same care he might have shown a sack of grain, tipping his hat without meeting her eyes. Folks in these parts had little patience for women traveling alone, especially those carrying obvious burdens. "You sure this is where you want to be left, miss?" The driver's weathered face creased with what might have been concern or mere curiosity. "Ain't much here for a lady in your condition." Lila clutched her worn Bible tighter, its leather cover soft from years of faithful handling. "This is where the Lord has led me," she replied, her voice carrying more conviction than she felt. "I'm grateful for your kindness in bringing me this far." The man shrugged, climbed back onto his perch, and with a sharp whistle to his horses, left her standing in a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the still afternoon air. As the sound of hooves faded, Lila became acutely aware of the silence that pressed in around her, not the peaceful quiet of prayer, but the hollow emptiness of a place that had lost its voice. The buildings that lined the street told stories of abandonment. A mercantile with windows so dust-caked they might have been painted brown. A saloon with doors that hung askew on rusted hinges. What might once have been a church stood at the far end of town, its steeple canted at an angle that suggested either poor construction or the slow surrender to time and weather. But it was the children that truly broke her heart. They appeared gradually, like cautious deer emerging from the brush. First one, then another, until she counted nearly a dozen young faces peering at her from doorways and around corners. Their clothes were patched and faded, their hair uncombed, their feet more often bare than shod. What struck her most profoundly was their eyes-old eyes in young faces, eyes that had learned not to expect much from the world. A girl of perhaps 8 approached with the careful steps of someone accustomed to disappointment. Her dress had been blue once, Lila guessed, though sun and wear had faded it to the color of winter sky. "You, the new teacher?" the child asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What makes you think I'm a teacher?" Lila knelt carefully, bringing herself to the girl's eye level, despite the awkwardness of her condition. "Mama said maybe someone would come. Sighed maybe someone would teach us letters, like the children in Santa Fe got." The girl's eyes flickered to the Bible in Lila's hands. "You got book learning, don't you?" The question pierced Lila's heart like a gentle arrow. She looked around at the other children, now drawing closer with the magnetic pull of possibility. When had she last seen such hunger, not for food, though she suspected that was scarce enough here, but for knowledge, for the keys to a larger world? "What's your name, child?" "Mary Catherine Burns, but everyone calls me Mouse on account of I'm small and quiet-like." "Well, Mouse, I do indeed have book learning, and I suspect the Lord brought me here for a reason." Lila stood slowly, her hand finding the small of her back. Where might a person find lodging in your town? Mouse pointed toward a narrow building, squeezed between the mercantile and what appeared to be a blacksmith's shop. Mrs. Henley takes in boarders sometimes. She's particular about folks, though. Particular about ladies who ain't got husbands. Lila felt the familiar flush of shame that accompanied such observations. She'd grown accustomed to the sideways glances, the whispered speculation, the assumption that a woman alone and with child could only mean one thing. The truth of her situation was both simpler and more complex than most imagined, but she'd learned that explanations rarely changed minds already made up. Thank you for the warning, Mouse. I'll keep that in mind. As Lila made her way toward the boarding house, her trunk bumping along behind her on makeshift wheels she'd fashioned from wagon parts, she felt the weight of watching eyes. Not just the children now, but adults too. A woman hanging laundry paused in her work to stare. Two men sitting outside the saloon nudged each other and spoke in low voices. An elderly man sweeping his porch stopped his work entirely. Mrs. Henley proved to be a woman of sharp angles and sharper opinions. She looked Lila up and down with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to judging character at first glance. I run a respectable establishment, she said without preamble. I don't tolerate drinking, gambling, or carrying on of any sort. I wouldn't expect anything less, Lila replied evenly. I'm a woman of faith, Mrs. Henley. I seek only a clean room and the chance to earn my keep honestly. And how might you plan to do that? The older woman's eyes fixed meaningfully on Lila's rounded form. Dustcreek ain't exactly brimming with opportunities for ladies in delicate circumstances. Lila straightened her shoulders. I'm educated. I can read and write, work sums, and I have a fair hand at needlework. Perhaps I might teach the children hereabouts. I noticed they seemed eager for learning. Mrs. Henley's expression shifted slightly, though whether toward approval or skepticism was difficult to determine. Teaching, is it? Well, Lord knows these children could use some civilizing. Running wild as they do, no proper schooling to speak of. Town tried to bring in a teacher couple years back, young man fresh from back east. Lasted all of 3 weeks before he hightailed it out of here. What happened to discourage him? Same thing that discourages most folks with sense. This town's dying, miss. Has been for years. The mine played out, the railroad passed us by, and most anyone with gumption enough to make something of themselves has already moved on. What's left is the stubborn, the defeated, and the children who don't know enough yet to leave. Lila looked out the window toward the street, where Mouse and several other children still lingered, their faces pressed against the glass of the mercantile, as if hoping to catch another glimpse of the woman with the book. Perhaps that's exactly why they need someone to stay. Miles above the town, on a ridge that afforded a commanding view of the entire valley, Silas Everhart stood on his front porch and watched the stranger's arrival through field glasses. From this distance, he could make out little more than her general form and the careful way she moved, but something about her bearing intrigued him. Most newcomers to Dustcreek Hollow fell into predictable categories: desperate, running from something, or simply lost. This woman seemed different, purposeful, despite her obvious vulnerability. Silas lowered the glasses and rubbed his eyes. At 52, he'd grown accustomed to solitude. His ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, worked by a small crew of men who understood his preference for silence and efficiency over conversation. He provided them with fair wages and decent quarters. They provided him with the cattle operation. That had made him the wealthiest man in 3 counties. It was a satisfactory arrangement that required little of his heart. The house behind him stood as testament to dreams once shared, but now born alone. Built for a family that never quite materialized, its rooms echoed with possibilities that had died with his wife, Catherine, 7 years past. He'd kept her things exactly as she'd left them, her books still open on the side table where she'd been reading, her sewing basket still holding the baby clothes she'd been embroidering for the child they'd lost along with her. The sound of approaching hoofs drew his attention back to the present. His foreman, Diego Vasquez, rode up the winding path from the valley below, his weathered face creased with the kind of expression that meant either trouble or gossip, often the same. Thing in a small community. Afternoon, Senator Silas. You see the woman who came in on the stage? I saw someone arrive. What of it? Diego dismounted and loosened his horse's girth, taking his time in the way of a man with a story to tell. The children, they think she might be a teacher. Mrs. Henley took her in, which is something. You know how particular that woman is about her boarders. Silas grunted non-committally, though his interest was piqued despite himself. Diego had been with him for over a decade, had seen him through the worst of his grief, and had earned the right to speak plainly. Might be good for the town, Diego continued, apparently taking Silas's silence as encouragement. Those children, they need something to hope for. And a woman with learning, especially one willing to teach. Well, it's been a long time since anyone cared about the future of this place. The future of Dustcreek Hollow isn't my concern, Silas replied, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. His ranch depended on the town for supplies and services. More than that, he'd grown up here, back when it was a thriving community full of families and dreams. Seeing it wither away stirred something in him he preferred not to examine too closely. Perhaps not, Diego agreed mildly. But a man can't help but wonder what drives a woman in her condition to come to a place like this. Takes either great faith or great desperation. Silas raised the field glasses again, though the stranger had long since disappeared into Mrs. Henley's boarding house. Or both, he murmured out that evening. As the sun painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Lila sat by the window in her small room and watched the children of Dustcreek Hollow emerge for their evening games. Even in their play, she could see the signs of lives lived without structure or guidance. Their games were rough, their language rougher, and their treatment of one another spoke of survival learned too young. Yet there was something in them that called to her resilience that reminded her of the wildflowers that bloomed stubbornly in the cracks of rocks, finding nourishment where none should exist. These children were growing up in the spaces between, in the forgotten corners of the world, but they were still growing. She opened her Bible to a passage that had sustained her through her own dark valleys. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The words seemed to glow in the lamplight, and she felt that familiar stirring in her spirit that had guided her to this unlikely place. Tomorrow, she would begin. Not with grand plans or elaborate schemes, but simply with what she had. A willing heart, an educated mind, and an unshakable belief that every child deserved a chance to reach beyond their circumstances. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life growing within, and whispered a prayer for wisdom, strength, and the courage to follow where love led. Outside her window, the children's voices gradually faded as parents called them in for supper, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In the distance, lights began to twinkle from the ranch house on the ridge, and Lila found herself wondering about the man who lived in such isolation, surrounded by so much land, yet apparently so alone. She didn't yet know that he was wondering about her too. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Lila made her way down Dustcreek Hollow's main street, her Bible tucked under one arm and her shawl drawn close against the desert chill. She'd risen early, unable to sleep past the rooster's crow that had echoed from some unseen farmyard, and had spent the pre-dawn hours in prayer and planning. Today, she would take the first step toward fulfilling what she increasingly felt was her calling in this forgotten place. The abandoned barn stood at the town's edge like a weathered monument to better times. Its roof sagged in places, and several boards had warped loose from the walls, but the structure remained sound. More importantly, it was large enough to hold a dozen children and far enough from the main street to avoid immediate interference from those who might object to her plans. Lila pushed open the heavy door, wincing as it scraped against the packed earth floor. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the walls, and the air carried the lingering scent of hay and livestock from years past. It wasn't much, but it would serve. She'd brought supplies, such as they were. A piece of charcoal wrapped in cloth for writing. Several smooth stones she'd gathered from the creek bed that might serve as writing surfaces. The worn pages from an old primer she'd discovered in Mrs. Henley's attic abandoned by some long departed. Bored her. Most precious of all, she carried a small slate that she'd fashioned herself from a piece of smooth wood, sanded carefully and darkened with ash mixed with water dot. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn. Mouse appeared in the doorway, her thin frame silhouetted against the morning light. Behind her, Lila could make out several other small figures hovering uncertainly. "You really gonna teach us?" Mouse asked, her voice carrying that careful tone children use when they're afraid. "To hope too openly." "I am indeed," Lila replied, smoothing her skirts as she sat on an overturned crate. "But first, I need to know who wants to learn. Learning isn't always easy, and it requires patience and practice." One by one, the children crept into the barn. Mouse, of course, but also a boy of perhaps 10, with serious dark eyes and clothes that had been mended so many times. They were more patch than original fabric. A pair of twins who couldn't have been more than 6, their hair so pale it was nearly white, and their faces decorated with matching constellations of freckles. An older girl, maybe 12, who carried herself with the premature dignity of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. "What are your names?" Lila asked gently, opening her Bible to a passage she'd marked. "I can't very well teach you if I don't know who you are." The serious boy spoke first. "Tommy Bradshaw, ma'am. My pay works at the livery when there's work to be had." The older girl straightened her shoulders. "Sarah Colton. These are my brothers, Jim and Jack." She indicated the twins with a protective gesture that spoke volumes about their family circumstances. Others followed Billy, whose father was the town drunk. Emma, who lived with her grandmother in a shack behind the mercantile. Little Pete, who couldn't have been more than 5, but whose eyes held the alert intelligence of someone eager to learn. "Well then," Lila said, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Let's begin with something simple. Who among you knows their letters?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Sarah raised her hand tentatively. "I know some, ma'am. My mama taught me a few before she went to be with Jesus." "That's a fine start, Sarah. And the rest of you, there's no shame in not knowing yet. That's why we're here." Lila opened her Bible to the first page of Genesis. "We're going to start with the most important letter of all, the letter that begins everything." She traced the letter A in the dirt with her finger, making the stroke large enough for all to see. "This is the letter A. It makes the sound ah like an apple or angel. Can you all say that sound?" A chorus of tentative ah sounds filled the barn, growing stronger as the children gained confidence. Layla felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of it, these forgotten children, hungry for knowledge, ready to embrace learning, despite everything life had already taught them about disappointment. "Now, let's all trace the letter in the dirt. Make it large. Don't worry about making it perfect." For the next hour, they worked on that single letter, writing it in dirt, scratching it onto stones, saying its sound until it became as natural as breathing. Tommy proved to have a quick mind and steady hand. The twins, Jim and Jack, turned the lesson into a game, competing to see who could make the finest letter. Sarah helped the younger ones, her natural leadership shining through Dot. It was Billy who provided the moment that would change everything. The boy had been struggling with the letter, his small fingers clumsy with the unfamiliar motions. Frustration had begun to cloud his features when suddenly something clicked. His face lit up with understanding, and he grabbed a piece of bark from the floor. "Asterisk, Miss Lila," he called out, his voice bright with excitement. "Miss Lila, look!" Scratched into the bark with painful precision was not just the letter A, but 4 letters that spelled a complete word. A-O-P-E. "Where did you learn that word, Billy?" Lila asked, her voice soft with wonder. "I didn't learn it, Nom. I just ... I just knew what it looked like the feeling I got when you started teaching us." He held up the bark proudly. "This here's what hope looks like written down." The other children crowded around to see, their excitement palpable. Here was proof that learning was possible, that the mysterious marks that educated people made on paper actually meant something they could understand. "Billy," Lila said, taking the piece of bark with reverent hands, You've just written your first word. And it's the most important word any of us could learn. Word of the impromptu school spread through Dustcreek Hollow with the speed that only significant news can achieve in a small town. By noon, Lila found herself facing a delegation of concerned citizens led by Mayor Jeremiah Polk, a man whose authority was derived more from his willingness to accept the position than from any particular qualifications for leadership. "Miss Fern," he said, removing his hat but keeping his expression stern, "I understand you've been conducting some sort of educational activities with our children." "I have indeed, Mayor Polk. The children are eager to learn, and I'm blessed to be able to help them." "Well now, that's all fine and good in principle, but you see, we have certain ways of doing things here. Can't just have anyone setting up shop and filling children's heads with ideas." Behind him stood several other men, including the father of one of her students. Their faces ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Lila felt her heart sink as she recognized the familiar pattern, the resistance that always seemed to arise when someone tried to change the established order, even when that order was clearly failing. "What sort of ideas concern you, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Reading and writing, for one thing, makes children dissatisfied with their lot in life, gives them notions about being better than their families, about leaving for greener pastures. We've seen it before, and what's wrong with wanting something better?" The question came from an unexpected source, Sarah's grandmother, Mrs. Colton, who had approached from behind the group of men. "Seems to me those children have been running wild long enough. At least now they're learning something useful." "Now see here, Martha," Mayor Polk began, but the elderly woman cut him off with a wave of her weathered hand. "I see plenty, Jeremiah. Polk, I see children who can't even write their own names, growing up ignorant in a world that has no patience for ignorance. This young lady is offering them a gift, and you want to throw it back in her face because you're afraid of change." The confrontation might have escalated further, but it was interrupted by the arrival of someone whose presence commanded immediate attention. Silas Everhart rode into town on a magnificent black stallion, his bearing that of a man accustomed to having his opinions carry weight. Lila had not yet met the mysterious rancher, but his reputation preceded him. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle and approached the group with measured steps. His eyes, she noticed, were a startling shade of blue, and they seemed to take in everything at once: the defensive posture of the mayor's delegation, the protective stance of Mrs. Colton, and Lila herself, standing quietly in the middle of it all with her hands folded over her rounded belly. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority that came with being the largest landowner in the county. "Ladies, I couldn't help but notice the gathering. Is there some concern that requires attention?" Mayor Polk immediately deferred to the rancher's obvious influence. "Mr. Everhart, sir, we were just discussing this educational situation. Miss Fern here has been teaching the children without proper authorization or oversight." Silas's gaze settled on Lila, and she felt an unexpected warmth under his scrutiny. "And what is your position on education, Miss Fern?" "I believe every child deserves the opportunity to learn, Mr. Everhart. Reading and writing are not luxuries. They're necessities for anyone who hopes to make their way in the world, even in a place like Dustcreek Hollow. Especially in a place like Dustcreek Hollow. These children have keen minds and willing hearts. They deserve the chance to discover what they're capable of achieving." Something flickered in Silas's eyes, approval, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He turned back to the mayor. "It seems to me, Polk, that the town has been blessed with someone willing to provide a service we've been lacking. Unless you have specific objections to the quality of Miss Fern's instruction, I see no reason to discourage such initiative." The mayor's bluster deflated visibly. When Silas Everhart spoke, people listened not just because of his wealth, but because his word carried the weight of integrity earned through years of fair dealing and sound judgment. "Well, that is to say, we just want to ensure proper oversight, and perhaps you should provide proper support instead," Silas suggested mildly. "A teacher requires supplies, suitable accommodations for instruction, and the backing of the community." Those seem like more productive concerns than finding reasons to discourage education. As the group dispersed some grudgingly, others with obvious relief, Silas approached Lila directly. Up close, she could see the lines that grief and solitude had etched around his eyes, but also the fundamental kindness that his brusque manner couldn't quite conceal. "Miss Fern," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I wanted to express my appreciation for what you're attempting here. These children have been neglected far too long. Thank you, Mr. Everhart. Your support means a great deal, especially coming from someone of your standing in the community. My standing is largely based on the size of my bank account and the extent of my property holdings. Your standing, it seems, is based on something far more valuable, willingness to see potential where others see only problems." As he remounted his horse and rode away, Lila felt something shift in the atmosphere around her mission. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but it had been balanced by support from an unexpected quarter. More than that, she found herself thinking about the sadness she'd glimpsed behind Silas Everhart's composed exterior, and wondering what sorrows had driven such a man to live in such isolation. That evening, as she reviewed the day's events in her small room, Lila held Billy's piece of bark with its carefully scratched word, hope. It seemed both a promise and a prayer, a declaration that change was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. Outside her window, the lights on the distant ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, and she found herself wondering if the man who lived there was looking down at the town and thinking about hope as well. The confrontation with Mayor Polk proved to be only the beginning of Lila's challenges. In the days that followed, she discovered that Dustcreek Hollow's resistance to change ran deeper than simple skepticism about education. For some residents, her very presence represented a threat to the carefully maintained order of their diminished world. 3 mornings after Billy's breakthrough with his first written word, Lila arrived at the barn to find the door barred shut, with a heavy wooden beam. Chalked across the weathered boards in crude letters was a message that made her stomach clench: nitrogen monoxide school for bastards. She stood staring at the ugly words, one hand pressed to her rounded belly, feeling the familiar shame wash over her, despite her efforts to remain strong. The baby stirred restlessly within her, as if sensing her distress, and she forced herself to take slow, measured breaths. "Don't you pay no mind to that nonsense, Miss Lila." She turned to find Tommy Bradshaw approaching with determined steps, his young face set in lines of righteous anger. Behind him came the other children, their expressions ranging from confused, hurt to blazing indignation. Who would do such a thing? Mouse asked, her small voice trembling with outrage. "Folks who are afraid," Lila replied carefully, lifting the heavy beam with Tommy's help. "Fear makes people say and do unkind things sometimes. But we ain't bastards," little Pete declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. "We got mamas and papas, most of us. The word wasn't meant for you children," Lila explained gently, though the explanation tasted bitter in her mouth. "Some people make assumptions about ladies who find themselves in my circumstances." Sarah, wise beyond her 12 years, understood immediately. "They're being mean about your baby coming, and you not having a husband to show for it. People can be quick to judge without knowing the whole story." Lila agreed, pushing open the barn door and stepping into the familiar space that had become their sanctuary of learning. As the children settled into their morning routine, Lila found herself watching them with new eyes. Their eagerness to learn remained undimmed by the ugly message outside, but she could see the protective way they positioned themselves around her, as if their small bodies could shield her from the world's cruelty. The realization that these children who had so little themselves were willing to defend her honor brought tears to her eyes. "Today we're going to learn about letters that work together," she announced, settling onto her customary crate and opening her Bible. "Sometimes, when letters join hands, they can make new sounds and new words." For the next hour, they worked on simple combinations, F and CH and SA, practicing the sounds and tracing the letters in the dirt. But Lila's concentration was divided. Part of her attention remained fixed on the door, wondering if their detractors might escalate beyond crude messages to more direct interference. Her fears proved justified when, just before noon, A group of women arrived led by Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, the banker's wife and self-appointed guardian of the town's moral standards. Unlike the men who had confronted her before, these women carried themselves with the particular authority of those who considered themselves the arbiters of proper behavior. Asterisk, Miss Fern, Mrs. Hartwell announced without preamble, "We need to have a discussion about your ... situation." Lila stood slowly, her hand automatically moving to support her lower back. At 7 months along, the physical demands of pregnancy were becoming more pronounced, and the stress of recent days hadn't helped. "What aspect of my situation concerns you, Mrs. Hartwell?" "I think you know very well what concerns us. It's simply not appropriate for someone in your ... condition ... to be influencing impressionable young minds." "What sort of example does it set?" "The example of an educated woman sharing knowledge with children who hunger for learning," Lila replied, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Knowledge isn't the only thing you're sharing. You're showing these children that certain behaviors are acceptable when they most certainly are not." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes fixed meaningfully on Lila's belly. "Proper moral instruction is just as important as book learning." Before Lila could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "And what exactly do you know about proper moral instruction, Prudence?" Mrs. Colton emerged from behind the barn, where she'd apparently been listening to the exchange. Her weathered face was set in lines of barely controlled fury, and her usually gentle demeanor had been replaced by something far more formidable. "Martha, this doesn't concern you," Mrs. Hartwell replied, though her certainty seemed to waver slightly. "Like hell it doesn't. These are my grandchildren getting their first real chance at education, and you want to take that away because you're more concerned with gossip than learning." The elderly woman stepped protectively closer to Lila. "This girl has shown more Christian charity in a week than you've managed in a lifetime of Sunday preaching. We simply feel that someone with more ... appropriate credentials should be handling the children's education." "Such as who?" Mrs. Colton challenged. "You? When's the last time you opened a book that wasn't full of recipes or household hints? At least Miss Lila here can actually read and write." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of a buckboard wagon driven by Diego Vasquez. The ranch foreman touched his hat respectfully to the assembled women and addressed Lila directly. "Senora Fern, I have been sent to deliver these to you." He gestured to several crates secured in the wagon bed. "Compliments of Senator Everhart." Lila approached the wagon with curiosity, the group of disapproving women momentarily forgotten. Diego began unloading the crates, revealing their contents with obvious pride. Books, dozens of them, ranging from basic primers to more advanced texts, slates and chalk, paper and pencils. Even a small bell that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. "Mr. Everhart sent these?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "See? Senora. He rode all the way to Santa Fe to purchase them from the teacher's supply house. He said the children of Dustcreek Hollow deserve proper materials for their education." The generosity of the gesture overwhelmed her. These supplies represented not just significant expense, but thoughtful consideration of exactly what a frontier school would need. More than that, they represented validation of her efforts from someone whose opinion clearly carried weight in the community. Mrs. Hartwell and her companions found themselves in the awkward position of criticizing an endeavor that had just received such substantial support from the town's most influential citizen. Their moral objections seemed petty in the face of such practical generosity. "Well," Mrs. Hartwell huffed, clearly struggling to maintain her position, "I suppose. That is, Mr. Everhart's involvement does put a different complexion on things." "Indeed it does," Mrs. Colton agreed with satisfaction. "Hard to argue with a man who puts his money where his mouth is." As the women departed, their mission thoroughly undermined by Silas's intervention, Lila found herself overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Gratitude for the supplies warred with concern about what his support might cost him socially. She was acutely aware that defending her put Silas at odds with established members of the community, people whose good opinion might matter for his business interests. That evening, she sat in her small room by lamplight examining each precious book and supply that had been delivered. A note had been tucked among the materials, written in a strong, masculine hand. Every child deserves the tools to build their future. Please accept these with my compliments and best wishes for your noble endeavor. S. Everhart, The Formality. Of the message couldn't quite hide the warmth behind it, and Lila found herself reading it several times, studying the careful formation of each letter. There was something deeply personal about handwriting. She mused. It revealed character in ways that spoken words sometimes couldn't. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the child shift restlessly within her. What do you think, little? One, she whispered. Is it possible that we've found not just a place to start over, but people who might actually care what happens to us? The baby's response was a firm kick that made her gasp and then smile. Perhaps even the unborn could sense when hope was beginning to take root. High on his ridge, Silas stood on his front porch and looked down at the town below. Light glowed softly from the window of the boarding house, where Lila Fern was undoubtedly reviewing the materials he'd sent. The decision to support her openly had been made on impulse, but he found he didn't regret it. In his coat pocket, he carried a small locket gold with an intricate engraving of roses on its surface. Inside was a miniature portrait of Catherine, painted just months before their wedding. He'd carried it every day for 7 years, a talisman of love lost and dreams abandoned. But tonight, as he watched the distant light and thought about the courage it took for a woman in Lila's circumstances to stand up to the town's moral guardians, he found his fingers tracing the locket's surface with something approaching peace rather than pain. Catherine had always believed in the power of education to transform lives. She would have approved of his decision to support the pregnant teacher who'd taken on such a difficult task with such grace. For the first time in years, Silas allowed himself to consider the possibility that supporting someone else's dreams might be the first step toward rediscovering his own. The arrival of proper school supplies transformed the makeshift classroom in ways that went far beyond the practical. Where once the children had scratched letters in dirt and carved words into bark, they now had real slates with actual chalk, their excited voices filling the barn with the distinctive squeaking sounds of learning in progress. But it was them, books that truly worked magic, opening windows to worlds these frontier children had never imagined. Lila discovered that teaching with adequate materials was like trying to paint with a full palette after working with only charcoal. The primer books allowed her to introduce concepts systematically, building each lesson on the foundation of the last. The advanced texts gave her hope that someday these children might progress beyond basic literacy to true scholarship. It was during the second week after the supplies arrived that she noticed him. Silas Everhart had taken to riding the perimeter of his property that bordered the town, a route that happened to take him past the barn during the children's morning lessons. At first, she assumed his presence was mere coincidence, a busy rancher checking his boundaries. But as the pattern continued, she began to suspect his motivations were more complex. The first direct encounter came on a Tuesday morning when little Pete's slate fell through a gap in the barn wall and landed outside. The boy was too small to reach it, and Lila too round with pregnancy to easily squeeze through the narrow opening. She was trying to figure out a solution when the missing slate appeared in the doorway, held by a large, work-roughened hand. "I believe this belongs to one of your students," Silas said, his deep voice carrying easily through the barn's interior. Mr. Everhart. Lila felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness as she accepted the slate. "Thank you." Pete was quite distressed about losing it. "Learning materials should be treasured," he replied seriously, though she caught a hint of amusement in his blue eyes. "They represent possibilities." The children had grown silent at his arrival, their natural wariness of adults clearly at war with curiosity about their mysterious benefactor. Sarah, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "Mr. Everhart, sir, we want to thank you proper-like for the books and slates. They're the finest things any of us ever owned." Silas's stern expression softened noticeably. "You're quite welcome, Miss Sarah. I trust you're putting them to good use?" "Oh, yes, sir. Miss Lila's teaching us to read whole sentences now. Watch this." Sarah picked up one of the primer books and read aloud in careful, measured tones. The cat sat on the mat. Asterisk. Very impressive, Silas said solemnly, though Lila noticed his eyes were twinkling. And what comes next in your studies? Miss Lila says we're going to learn about numbers soon. How to cipher and work sums and such. Mathematics is indeed important. A person needs to understand numbers to make their way in the world. Whether that's running a business, managing a household, or simply ensuring they're not cheated in trade. Lila seized the moment, sensing an opportunity to further legitimize her school in the children's eyes. Perhaps you might share some practical examples of how you use mathematics in your ranching operations, Mr. Everhart. The children would benefit from understanding real-world applications. The request clearly caught him off guard, and for a moment she worried she'd overstepped. But then he nodded slowly. I suppose I could spare a few minutes to discuss the calculations involved in managing cattle and land. What followed was an impromptu lesson that proved far more engaging than any textbook example could have been. Silas explained how he tracked the number of head of cattle, calculated feed requirements based on herd size and seasonal availability, and determined market timing based on price fluctuations and transportation costs. The children listened with rapt attention, their questions revealing minds eager to understand how book learning connected to real life. So you have to know all the numbers just to be sure your cows don't starve? Tommy asked with evident amazement. Precisely. And if I calculate incorrectly, it could mean the difference between profit and loss, between keeping the ranch running and having to sell it to someone else. When Silas finally took his leave, promising to return the following week to discuss more mathematical applications, Lila found herself studying his retreating figure with new appreciation. Beneath his reserved exterior lay a natural teacher's instinct and a genuine understanding of how to make learning relevant to young minds. It was Mouse who voiced what they were all thinking. He ain't scary like folks said. He's kind, just ... careful like. Sometimes people build walls around themselves when they've been hurt, Lila observed gently. It doesn't mean they don't care about others. The comment proved more prophetic than she realized. That very afternoon, she discovered an envelope tucked beneath her door at the boarding house. Inside was a sum of money that made her gasp enough to cover her room and board for 3 months, along with a brief note for educational expenses and personal necessities. A teacher should not have to worry about basic needs while serving the community. The generosity overwhelmed her, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. Such significant financial support suggested more than casual interest in her educational efforts. It spoke of someone who had given considerable thought to her circumstances and decided to take action to improve them. Mrs. Henley, who had been hovering nearby when Lila discovered the envelope, was predictably curious about its contents. More supplies from your mysterious benefactor? She asked with barely concealed speculation. Mr. Everhart has been very supportive of the school. Lila replied carefully, tucking the money away. Indeed he has. Folks are starting to talk, you know. Wondering what's behind such sudden generosity from a man who's kept to himself for 7 years. The observation troubled Lila more than she cared to admit. The last thing she wanted was for Silas's kindness toward her to become the subject of gossip that might damage his reputation. She'd already cost him some standing with the more conservative elements of the community. She couldn't bear the thought that supporting her might isolate him. Further, her concerns deepened when she received an unexpected visitor that evening. Diego Vasquez appeared at her door just after sunset, his hat in his hands and his weathered face creased with something that looked like worry. Senora Fern, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I come with a message from Senator Silas, but also with some words of my own. Please, come in, Lila said, though Mrs. Henley's presence in the hallway made it clear their conversation would not be private. Senator Silas, he asks me to tell you that if you have need of anything at all, you should not hesitate to send word. He wants you to know that you have his complete support. That's very kind of him. Please express my gratitude. Diego nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Senora, if I may speak frankly, there are those in town who are curious about my patron's interest in your welfare. A whisper that perhaps his motivations are not entirely, how do you say, philanthropic? Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I assure you, Mr. Vasquez, that my relationship with Mr. Everhart is entirely proper. He has been generous in supporting education for the children, nothing more. I believe this, Senora, and I think you are a good woman trying to do good work. But Senator Silas, he has been alone for many years since his wife died. People see him taking special interest in a young woman, and they make assumptions." "What are you suggesting I should do?" Diego's kind eyes were filled with genuine concern. "I suggest nothing, Senora. I only ask that you understand my patron is a good man, but he is also a man who feels things deeply. If he is beginning to care for you, it is not something he takes lightly. And if others begin to whisper that you are taking advantage ... of his feelings ... double quotes, the implication hung heavy in the air. Lila's reputation was already suspect due to her unmarried condition and pregnancy. If people began to believe she was manipulating Silas's emotions for financial gain, it could destroy both her school and any chance she had of building a respectable life in Dustcreek Hollow. "I understand your concern," she said quietly. "I would never want to cause trouble for Mr. Everhart. His support has meant everything to the children and to me." "I know this, Senora, but perhaps it would be wise to be extra careful about appearances. Small towns have long memories and sharp tongues." After Diego left, Lila sat in her small room and stared at the envelope of money that represented both blessing and burden. Outside her window, the lights on the distant ridge glowed like earthbound stars, and she found herself wondering what Silas Everhart was thinking as he looked down at the town below. The baby stirred restlessly within her as she placed both hands on her rounded belly. "What have we gotten ourselves into, little one?" she whispered. "And what price might we all pay for the kindness of a lonely man who's forgotten how to guard his heart?" The questions had no easy answers, but one thing was becoming clear. The simple act of teaching children to read had set in motion forces that would forever change the quiet rhythms of Dustcreek Hollow. Whether that change would bring redemption or ruin remained to be seen. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by the same stagecoach that had brought Lila to Dustcreek Hollow 3 months earlier. Mrs. Henley handed it to her with obvious curiosity, her sharp eyes noting the formal script in quality paper that marked it as something more significant than ordinary correspondence. Lila's hands trembled as she recognized the handwriting. She'd hoped, prayed that distance and time would be enough to keep her past from following her west. The letter proved that hope to be naive. "Miss Elizabeth Harper," the envelope read, using the name she'd tried so hard to leave behind. The words seemed to burn her fingers as she carried the letter to her room, her heart hammering against her ribs. The contents were brief but devastating. "Elizabeth, we know where you are. Your theft cannot remain hidden forever. Return what you took, or face the consequences of your actions. We will not be patient indefinitely. J.A." The initials made her stomach clench. Joshua Hampton, her former employer, the man whose accusations had driven her from her comfortable position as governess in St. Louis, whose lies had made it impossible for her to find work anywhere that decent references were required. She pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the child move restlessly within her, as if sensing her distress. The baby was Joshua's, conceived during a night when grief and loneliness had overcome her better judgment after the death of his wife, her dear friend Margaret. What followed had been months of shame and terror as Joshua, desperate to protect his political ambitions, had accused her of stealing family jewelry to cover his own embezzlement from his business partner. The jewelry had never existed, fact that would eventually come to light, but not before Lila's reputation was destroyed, and she was forced to flee west with nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter knowledge that the man who had fathered her child would rather see her hang than acknowledge his own sins. A gentle knock at her door interrupted her dark thoughts. "Miss Lila?" Mouse's voice carried through the thin wood. "We're ready for lessons when you are." Lila hastily folded the letter and tucked it away, forcing her features into some semblance of composure. "I'll be right there, dear one." But as she made her way to the barn, the weight of the letter seemed to press against her with every step. Joshua had found her, which meant others might follow. her carefully constructed new life in Dustcreek Hollow, her school, her growing friendship with the children, even her complicated feelings about Silas Everhart. All of it could crumble if her past caught up with her. The children were already gathered in the barn when she arrived, their faces bright with anticipation. In the weeks since Silas had provided proper supplies, their progress had been remarkable. Tommy could now read simple stories aloud, his serious young face lighting up with pride at each conquered word. The twins had mastered basic arithmetic and delighted in any excuse to demonstrate their skills. Even little Pete, barely 5 years old, could write his name with careful, determined strokes. "Miss Lila, you look peaked," Sarah observed with the sharp eye of someone forced to be observant about adult moods. "Are you feeling poorly?" "Just a little tired, sweetheart. The baby gets restless sometimes and makes it hard to sleep." The lie came easily, but it tasted bitter in her mouth. These children had given her their trust so completely. The thought of disappointing them felt like a physical weight on her chest. They settled into their morning routine, working through reading exercises and mathematics problems. But Layla found her concentration scattered, her mind returning again and again to the letter and its implications. What would happen to the children's education if she were forced to flee again? Who would continue the work she'd started? It was during the arithmetic lesson that Silas appeared in the doorway, his weekly visit having become as regular as sunrise. The children greeted him with genuine enthusiasm now, their initial wariness replaced by affection for the stern man who took such interest in their progress. "Good morning, Miss Fern. Children?" His eyes lingered on Lila's face with an intensity that made her wonder what he saw there. "I trust the week has been productive?" "Oh, yes, sir," Tommy exclaimed before Lila could respond. "Miss Lila taught us about fractions yesterday. I can work out how to divide a pie into equal pieces, and everything." "A valuable skill indeed," Silas replied gravely, "both for ensuring fair distribution and for understanding business partnerships." He paused, his gaze returning to Lila. "Miss Fern, might I have a word with you privately?" The request sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. Had he somehow learned about the letter? Was he here to withdraw his support before the scandal of her past could touch him? "Children, please continue working on your slate exercises," she said, following Silas outside into the crisp morning air. They walked a short distance from the barn before he stopped and turned to face her. "Forgive my directness, but you seem troubled today. Is there anything I might do to help?" The simple kindness in his voice nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. "You've already done so much, Mr. Everhart, more than I could ever have hoped for or deserved." "What we deserve and what we need are often different things," he replied quietly. "And I've found that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept help when it's offered." For a moment, Lila was tempted to tell him everything about Joshua, about the false accusations, about the letter that threatened to destroy the fragile peace she'd found in Dustcreek Hollow. But the thought of seeing disappointment or disgust replace the warmth in his blue eyes stopped her. "I appreciate your concern, truly. I'm just adjusting to all the changes in my life. Sometimes the future feels uncertain." Silas nodded slowly, and she sensed he understood there was more to her distress than she was willing to share. "Miss Fern, I want you to know that whatever brought you to Dustcreek Hollow, whatever circumstances led you here, I believe you're exactly where you're meant to be. These children need you. The town needs you." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of vulnerability that made her heart ache. "And if I may be so bold, I think perhaps you need us as well." The admission hung between them. Like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. Lila felt tears prick her eyes at the gentle acceptance in his voice, the suggestion that she belonged somewhere, that her presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. "Mr. Everhart," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the gratitude and fear warring in her chest. "Silas," he corrected softly. "I think we've moved beyond formal titles, don't you?" Silas. His name felt warm on her tongue, like a promise she wasn't sure she was brave enough to make. "I want you to know that your friendship means more to me than I can express. These past weeks, watching you with the children, seeing your genuine care for their education, It's restored my faith in the possibility of goodness. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that transformed his weathered features. You speak of goodness as if you doubt your own. I see a woman who left everything familiar to provide hope for forgotten children. I see courage and compassion and strength that humbles me. The intensity of his words, the warmth in his voice, sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with the baby she carried. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to accept the future he seemed to be offering, a life built on mutual respect and shared purpose, a chance to heal old wounds in the gentle embrace of understanding love. But then Joshua's letter seemed to crackle in her pocket like a malevolent presence, reminding her that some wounds might be too deep, some pasts too complicated for even the most generous heart to accept. I should get back to the children, she said reluctantly, though what she really wanted was to stand there forever, basking in the warmth of his regard. Of course. But as she turned to go, his voice stopped her. Lila, the sound of her given name on his lips sent warmth spiraling through her chest. She turned back to find him studying her with an expression that took her breath away. Whatever storms may come, you don't have to weather them alone. That evening, as she sat in her room, with Joshua's letter spread before her, Lila found herself thinking about Silas's words. The storm was indeed coming. She could feel it gathering like clouds on the horizon. The question was whether she would have the courage to trust in the shelter of understanding love, or whether fear would drive her to flee again before she could be disappointed by the limits of even the most generous heart. Outside her window, the lights on the distant ridge glowed steadily through the darkness, and she found herself drawing strength from their constancy. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was not alone. Tonight she was part of something larger than her fears, a community of children hungry for knowledge, a man learning to hope again, and her own heart slowly remembering what it meant to trust in the possibility of belonging somewhere permanently. Letter lay before her like a challenge, but for the first time since its arrival, she didn't feel entirely powerless against what it represented. Perhaps Silas was right. Perhaps she didn't have to weather this storm alone. The idea came to Silas during a sleepless night 3 weeks after his conversation with Lila outside the barn. He'd been standing on his porch, looking down at the town where a single light still glowed in the window of the boarding house, when the solution presented itself with startling clarity. The children needed a proper school. Lila needed security and legitimacy. And he needed a purpose that went beyond managing cattle and counting profits. The next morning found him at his desk, sketching rough plans with the enthusiasm of a man who discovered a worthy use for his accumulated wealth. Not just a schoolhouse, but a real institution that could serve the community for generations. 2 large classrooms to accommodate different age groups. A small library. Living quarters for the teacher that would provide both privacy and respectability. When Diego arrived for their weekly planning meeting, he found his employer bent over architectural drawings with an intensity usually reserved for livestock breeding. Records. Center Silas, what is this you are working on? Plans for a schoolhouse, Silas replied without looking up. A proper one, built to last. I want construction to begin immediately. Diego studied the sketches with growing amazement. This is very ambitious, patron, and very expensive. Money well spent. These children deserve better than lessons in a drafty barn, and Miss Fern deserves working conditions that reflect the importance of her task. And you, Senator? What do you deserve? The question stopped Silas cold. He looked up to find Diego regarding him with the penetrating gaze of someone who'd known him long enough to see past surface explanations. I deserve the satisfaction of seeing a worthy project completed, he said finally. Ah, Diego nodded sagely. And perhaps also the satisfaction of seeing a certain teacher smile when she realizes her dreams are becoming reality. Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks, but didn't deny the observation. Miss Fern has sacrificed much to serve this community. It's only right that the community should support her efforts properly. Indeed. And if the community's support happens to come from one particular member who finds himself thinking about said teacher rather more often than cattle prices, well, that is nobody's business but his own. The construction began within the week, with workers arriving from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, along with wagon loads of quality lumber, glass for windows, and even a bell ordered specially from back east. The entire town watched with fascination as the framework rose on a carefully chosen site at the edge of the main street, close enough to be convenient, far enough from the saloon to maintain proper decorum. Lila learned about the project when Tommy burst into the barn one morning, his face flushed with excitement. "Miss Lila, come see, they're building us a real school." She followed the children outside to find a scene of purposeful activity. Men with hammers and saws worked under the direction of a master carpenter, while others unloaded supplies from seemingly endless wagons. At the center of it all stood Silas, consulting with the builder and pointing toward various aspects of the emerging structure. "It's going to be beautiful," Sarah breathed, her young voice filled with awe. "Look, Miss Lila, real glass windows and everything." Lila stared at the construction site with emotions that ranged from gratitude to terror. The schoolhouse represented validation of her work, security for her future, and legitimacy for her position in the community. But it also represented a level of investment, both financial and emotional, that made her feel deeply indebted to the man who'd made it possible. As if sensing her gaze, Silas looked up from his consultation with the builder. Their eyes met across the construction site, and even at that distance, she could see the question in his expression, the hope that his gesture would be received as the gift it was intended to be, rather than the burden it might become. She managed a smile and a small wave, which he returned with obvious relief. But as she shepherded the children back to their lessons, her mind churned with complications she hadn't anticipated when she'd first begun teaching in the abandoned barn. The letter from Joshua lay heavy in her thoughts, its threat growing more ominous with each passing day. How could she accept such generosity from Silas when she might be forced to flee at any moment? How could she allow him to invest so much in a future that her past might destroy without warning? The dilemma came to a head that evening when Silas appeared at Mrs. Henley's boarding house, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully composed. "Miss Fern," he said when she answered his knock, "I was hoping we might take a walk. There are some matters regarding the school that I'd like to discuss with you." They strolled slowly through the gathering dusk, past the construction site where the skeleton of the schoolhouse stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. The sound of their footsteps on the dusty street seemed unnaturally loud in the evening. "Quiet. It's a beautiful design," Lila said finally, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I hope it will serve your purposes well. The living quarters are designed to provide both comfort and privacy, with a separate entrance to maintain proper appearances." The thoughtfulness behind every detail touched her deeply. "Silas, I don't know how to thank you for such generosity, but I'm concerned that people will assume." "Let them talk," he said quietly. "I'm past caring what people assume about my motivations. This town needs a school, those children need education, and you need a secure position that reflects your worth as a teacher and as a person." They paused beside the construction site, and Silas pointed toward where the foundation had been laid. "There," he said, "that stone there with the date carved into it. I placed it myself this morning." Layla moved closer to examine the cornerstone, squinting in the dim light to make out the inscription, "Dustcreek Hollow School, founded 1875. Train up a child in the way he should go." The biblical reference brought tears to her eyes. It was the same passage that had sustained her during her darkest moments, the verse that had convinced her to begin teaching despite all the obstacles. "How did you know?" she whispered. It seemed appropriate. Education is about more than just reading and writing. It's about shaping character, opening minds, and preparing young people to make their mark on the world. The sincerity in his voice, the evident thought he'd put into every aspect of the project, overwhelmed her carefully. Maintained composure. "Silas, there's something I need to tell you. Something about my past, about why I came here." He turned to face her fully, his expression grave but not unkind. "Lila, we all carry secrets. We all have chapters in our stories that we'd rather not share. Whatever brought you to Dustcreek Hollow, I'm grateful for it. You've brought life back to this town, hope to these children, and..." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. And you've reminded me that there are still things worth caring about in this world. A admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Lila felt the weight of Joshua's letter in her pocket, the knowledge that her past could still destroy the fragile future they were building together. But looking into Silas's eyes, seeing the genuine affection and respect there, she found herself taking a step toward trust rather than away from it. My real name is Elizabeth Harper, she said quietly. I was a governess in St. Louis before I came here. I left under ... difficult circumstances. There are people who might still be looking. For me, people who believe I did something I didn't do. Silas listened without interruption as she told him about Joshua, about the false accusations, about the letter that had arrived threatening to expose her. She left out the most painful detail, that Joshua was the father of her unborn child, but shared enough to make him understand the precarious nature of her situation. When she finished, they stood in silence for a long moment. Then Silas reached out and gently took her hand in his. Elizabeth, he said, using her real name with careful reverence. Thank you for trusting me with the truth. And I want you to know that nothing you've told me changes how I see you or how I feel about what you're doing here. But if these people come here, if they try to cause trouble, then they'll find themselves dealing with more than just one pregnant teacher, he said firmly. This is your home now, Lila Elizabeth, whoever you choose to be. And home is where people stand with you against whatever storms may come. The promise in his voice, the strength of his conviction, sent warmth flooding through her chest. 4. The first time since Joshua's letter had arrived, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps running wasn't her only option. Perhaps there were people who would stand with her against the shadows of her past as they walked back toward the boarding house. The foundation stone caught the last rays of the setting sun, its carved words seeming to glow with promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was part of something permanent, something worth fighting for. The schoolhouse rising from the earth like hope made manifest, and the man beside her whose quiet strength had become her anchor in an uncertain world. These were gifts she had never dared to dream of. Now, standing on the threshold of a future she was finally brave enough to claim, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected grace that had led her to this moment. This place, this chance to become who she was always meant to be. The wanted poster arrived with the morning mail, delivered by a circuit rider who seemed unusually interested in studying the faces of everyone he encountered in Dustcreek Hollow. Mrs. Henley accepted it along with the usual collection of letters and notices, but something about the official seal and heavy paper caught her attention immediately. She unfolded it in her kitchen, and what she saw made her gasp aloud. There, rendered in stark black ink, was an unmistakable likeness of her current boarder, though the woman in the drawing looked harder somehow, more desperate than the gentle teacher who'd been living under her roof for months. Wanted for theft, the poster proclaimed in bold letters. Elizabeth Harper, also known as Lila Fern, $500 reward for information leading to arrest and conviction. Contact J. Hampton, St. Louis, Missouri. Mrs. Henley's hands trembled as she read the details. The accusations were serious embezzlement of a substantial sum from her employer, theft of family jewelry, fleeing justice across territorial lines. But what troubled her more than the charges themselves was the discrepancy between the desperate criminal described in the poster and the patient, devout woman who'd been transforming the town's children through education. For an hour, she sat at her kitchen table staring at the poster, wrestling with conflicting loyalties. On one hand, her duty as a law-abiding citizen seemed clear. On the other hand, she'd watched Lila Elizabeth pour her heart into teaching children who'd been forgotten by everyone else. She'd seen the genuine care, the personal sacrifice, the quiet faith that drove everything the young woman did. The decision was taken from her when Mayor Polk arrived for his weekly inspection of the boarding house's license compliance, a transparent excuse to indulge his curiosity about the town's affairs. His eyes immediately fixed on the poster spread across her kitchen table. Well, well, he said, his voice thick with vindication. What have we here, Mrs. Henley? Before she could stop him, he'd snatched up the poster and was reading it with obvious relish. His expression shifted from surprise to satisfaction, to something approaching glee as he absorbed the implications. "This explains everything," he declared. "The mysterious past, the reluctance to discuss her previous positions, the sudden appearance in a town where no one asks too many questions. We've been harboring a common criminal." "Now see here, Jeremiah," Mrs. Henley protested, her protective instincts finally overriding her uncertainty. "Just because someone's accused of something doesn't mean they're guilty. That young woman has done nothing but good since she arrived here. Has she now? Or has she been using those children to create a respectable facade while she hides from justice?" Mayor Polk was already mentally calculating the glory that would come from solving such a high-profile case. $500 is a considerable reward, Mrs. Henley. Enough to make significant improvements to our town. Mrs. Henley watched in growing alarm as the mayor's greed overtook whatever limited wisdom he possessed. "What are you planning to do?" "My civic duty, of course. I'll send word to this J. Hampton immediately. Then organize a town meeting to discuss our ... situation. The citizens have a right to know they've been deceived." He stormed out with the poster clutched in his fist, leaving Mrs. Henley staring after him with a growing sense of dread. She'd seen what righteous indignation could do to a small town, how quickly neighborly concern could transform into mob mentality. Whatever truth lay behind the accusations against Lila, the young woman deserved better than trial by gossip and greed. The news spread through Dustcreek Hollow with the inexorable speed of scandal. By noon, clusters of townspeople gathered on street corners, their voices rising and falling in animated discussion. Some defended the woman who brought learning to their children. Others proclaimed they'd known something was suspicious about her from the beginning. It was Diego who brought word to Silas, riding hard from town with his weathered face creased with worry. He found his employer inspecting the nearly completed schoolhouse, discussing final details with the master carpenter. "Center Silas," Diego called out, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "We have trouble. Big trouble." Silas excused himself from the conversation and walked to where Diego stood holding a folded paper with obvious reluctance. "What's happened?" Without a word, Diego handed him the wanted poster. Silas felt the world tilt as he studied the drawing unmistakably. Lila, but rendered with an artist's interpretation that emphasized desperation and cunning rather than the gentle strength he'd come to know. Where did this come from? Circuit Rider delivered it this morning. Mayor Polk has already called a town meeting for tonight. He's talking about sending for a U.S. Marshal, about claiming the reward money for the town's coffers. Silas's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implications. The charges were serious enough to result in federal prosecution if Lila were extradited back to Missouri. But more immediate was the danger posed by a town suddenly convinced they'd been harboring a fugitive. "Have you seen Miss Fern today?" She was teaching the children as usual this morning, but by now someone will have told her about the poster. "Senator, what do you think we should do?" For a moment, Silas simply stood there, his mind racing through possibilities. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to distance himself from Lila immediately. His reputation, his business interests, even his personal safety could be compromised by association with an accused criminal. But as he looked at the schoolhouse they'd built together, as he thought about the light in her eyes when she spoke about the children's progress, he found that safety held no appeal compared to loyalty. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to hear Miss Fern's side of this story before we let fear and greed make our decisions for us." They found Lila in the barn where she'd first begun teaching, sitting alone among the scattered slates and books that had been abandoned when the children were suddenly called home by worried parents. She looked up as they entered, and Silas saw immediately that she already knew about the poster. "They came for their children," she said quietly, her voice steady, but her hands trembling where they rested on her rounded belly. One by one, until only the empty barn remained. Lily ... Silas began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Elizabeth," she corrected with bitter irony. "I suppose we should use my real name, now that it's plastered all over town." Diego cleared his throat diplomatically. "Senora, perhaps you could tell us what really happened in St. Louis?" "The accusations in this poster are lies," she said flatly. Convenient lies told by a powerful man to cover his own crimes and protect his reputation. Slowly, painfully, she told them the whole truth. About Joshua Hampton, the respected businessman and politician who'd employed her as governess to his daughter. About Margaret, Joshua's wife and Lila's dear friend, whose death from consumption had left them both grief-stricken and vulnerable. About the night when comfort had turned to passion, and passion had led to the child she now carried. The jewelry never existed, she explained, her voice growing stronger as she faced the demons she'd been running from. Joshua embezzled money from his business partner to fund his political campaigns. When the partner began asking questions, Joshua needed a scapegoat. A pregnant governess with no family to defend her proved convenient. But surely the truth will come out eventually, Silas said. If the jewelry never existed, eventually, yes. But Joshua is a patient man with powerful friends. He can afford to wait while I languish in prison or worse. The reward isn't about recovering stolen property. It's about silencing the only person who knows what really happened. The barn fell silent except for the distant sound of construction work halting as news of the scandal reached the building. Crew. Through the open door, they could see people gathering in the street, their voices carrying the unmistakable tone of a community in turmoil. What will you do? Diego asked gently. Lila stood slowly, her hand pressed to her lower back as she struggled with the weight of advanced pregnancy. What I should have done months ago. Leave before I cause any more trouble for people who've shown me nothing but kindness. No. The word came from Silas with such quiet force that both Lila and Diego turned to stare at him. You're not running again. Silas, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. A man with power and influence is using the law to cover his own crimes. An innocent woman is being persecuted for his sins. And a community that should be grateful for your service is ready to sacrifice you for blood money. His blue eyes blazed with righteous anger. Well, they'll have to go through me first. You can't protect me from this, Lila protested, though. Hope flickered in her voice. The law requires proof, not just accusations. And until I see evidence beyond the word of a man I've never met, you have my complete support. Diego nodded grimly. And mine, Signora. Whatever comes, you have all eyes in this fight. The sound of approaching voices interrupted their conversation. Through the barn's open door, they could see Mayor Polk leading a group of men toward them, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. At the front of the group walked a stranger, a tall man in a travel-worn suit whose predatory smile marked him as someone who made his living from other people's misfortune. That will be the bounty hunter, Lila said with resigned recognition. They move quickly when their reward is substantial. Silas stepped protectively in front of her as the group reached the barn. Gentlemen, he said evenly, to what do we owe this ... delegation? Mayor Polk puffed out his chest with self-importance. Mr. Everhart, I'm afraid we have a serious situation. This woman, he pointed accusingly at Lila, is a wanted fugitive. Mr. Kane here is a licensed bounty hunter, and he's come to escort her back to Missouri to face justice. Kane stepped forward with an oily smile. Ma'am, I'll need you to come with me peacefully. No sense making this harder than it needs to be. On what authority? Silas demanded, not moving from his protective position. On the authority of this federal warrant, Kane replied, producing an official-looking document. Elizabeth Harper is wanted for felony theft. I'm legally authorized to arrest her and transport her back to Missouri. Silas examined the warrant. Carefully, his lawyer's training from years of business dealings serving him well. This warrant is based solely on the accusations of one man. Where's the evidence? Where are the witnesses? That's for the courts to decide, Kane said impatiently. My job is just to deliver her. Your job, said a new voice from the barn's entrance, is to follow the law properly. And I'm afraid there are some irregularities here that need to be addressed. They all turned to see a distinguished man in a sheriff's badge and clean traveling clothes. Behind him stood Mrs. Colton and several other townspeople, their faces set with determination. Sheriff Martinez, Santa Fe County, the man introduced himself. I received word about this situation and rode hard to get here before any ... misunderstandings occurred. Kane's confidence visibly wavered. "Sheriff, I have proper authorization. You have a warrant based on uncorroborated accusations from a man who, according to my recent correspondence with Missouri authorities, is himself under investigation for embezzlement and fraud." Sheriff Martinez's voice carried the weight of real authority. "Until those investigations are concluded, this woman is under my protection as a potential witness in a federal case." Asterisk, the revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Kane's face darkened with anger, while Mayor Polk looked between the two lawmen with obvious confusion. "Furthermore," the sheriff continued, "I've been in communication with Miss Harper's former colleagues in St. Louis. It seems several of them have come forward with information that contradicts Mr. Hampton's version of events." Lila felt her knees go weak with relief and shock. "Margaret's sister," she whispered. "She always suspected." "Indeed, Miss Whitfield has provided testimony about her brother-in-law's financial difficulties and his inappropriate behavior toward you after her sister's death. Combined with evidence of his embezzlement activities, it appears Mr. Hampton chose to eliminate a witness rather than face justice himself. The wanted poster that had seemed so damning just hours before was suddenly revealed as what it truly was: a desperate attempt by a guilty man to silence the one person who could expose his crimes. As the truth sank in, the mood of the crowd shifted dramatically, shame replacing righteous indignation. Kane, his profitable enterprise evaporating before his eyes, made one last attempt to assert his authority. "Sheriff, regardless of these new allegations, I still have a valid warrant, which I'm now avoiding pending the outcome of the investigation in Missouri." Sheriff Martinez's tone brooked no argument. "Miss Harper, you're free to remain here while the legal proceedings sort themselves out. And I strongly suspect that when they do, you'll be vindicated completely." As the crowd dispersed, Kane slinking away in obvious frustration, Mayor Polk muttering about missed opportunities, Lila found herself supported by Silas's strong arms as the stress and relief of the day finally overwhelmed her. "It's over," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "No," Silas replied, his voice warm with promise as he looked toward the nearly completed schoolhouse. "It's just beginning." The revelation of Joshua Hampton's true nature had cleared Lila's name, but it also brought unexpected complications. Word traveled fast in the territories, and within days of Sheriff Martinez's announcement, Dustcreek Hollow found itself hosting a steady stream of visitors, federal investigators, territorial officials, and newspaper correspondents eager to cover the story of political corruption exposed by a frontier school teacher. More troubling was the telegram that arrived 3 days after Kane's departure, delivered to Silas personally by a grim-faced circuit rider. The message was brief but ominous. "Hampton's associates seeking alternative resolution. Suggest increased vigilance. Sheriff Martinez." Silas read the telegram twice before its implications fully sank in. Joshua Hampton might be facing federal investigation, but powerful men had ways of protecting themselves that didn't always involve legal channels. If Hampton had decided that Lila's testimony posed an unacceptable threat to his freedom, he might resort to more direct methods of silencing her. He found Lila in the nearly completed schoolhouse, carefully arranging books on the shelves that had been installed just that morning. At 8 months pregnant, her movements were careful and deliberate, but her face glowed with satisfaction as she transformed the empty rooms into the educational sanctuary she dreamed of creating. "It's beautiful," she said without looking up as he entered. "Better than anything I imagined when I first started teaching in that old barn." "Lila," he said quietly, and something in his tone made her turn to face him fully. "We need to talk." He handed her the telegram, watching her expression shift from curiosity to concern to carefully controlled fear as she absorbed its contents. "He's not going to simply accept defeat, is he?" she said finally. Powerful men rarely do, especially when they have as much to lose as Hampton appears to. Silas moved closer, his protective instincts evident in every line of his body. "Sheriff Martinez is concerned enough to send warnings. I think we need to take precautions." "What sort of precautions?" "Diego and I have been discussing security arrangements. We can post men around the schoolhouse and the boarding house, establish patterns that make it difficult for strangers to approach unnoticed. Lila placed her hands on her rounded belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly within her, as if responding to her increased stress. I won't live in fear, Silas. I won't let Joshua Hampton's desperation turn this town into an armed camp. And I won't let him harm you or your child, Silas replied with quiet steel in his voice. Not when you're so close to having everything you've worked for. It was true. The schoolhouse would be ready for its grand opening within the week. The children, all of them, now that her name had been cleared, were eager to return to their studies in proper classrooms. The town council, properly chastened by their rush to judgment, had formally appointed her as Dustcreek Hollow's first official teacher, with a salary that would provide genuine security for her and her child. With triumph came vulnerability. Lila was no longer an anonymous refugee who could disappear at a moment's notice. She was now a public figure whose testimony could destroy a powerful man's career and freedom. That made her both valuable and dangerous in ways that kept Silas awake at night, staring at the ceiling while his mind catalogued all the ways Hampton might try to eliminate the threat she represented. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later. When Tommy Bradshaw burst into the schoolhouse during the afternoon painting session, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. Miss Lila, there's strangers in town asking questions about you. Silas, who had taken to spending most of his days at the schoolhouse under the pretense of overseeing final construction details, immediately set down his paintbrush. What kind of questions, Tommy? About where Miss Lila lives, what her routine is when she's alone. Pa told me to come warn you quick-like. Through the schoolhouse window, they could see 2 men in dusty traveling clothes making their way methodically from building to building, clearly conducting some sort of investigation. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of professionals, and something about their bearing suggested they weren't federal investigators or journalists. Diego, Silas called to his foreman, who was installing the final window frames. Take Tommy and go gather the others. Quietly, I want every man we trust positioned around this building within 10 minutes. As Diego hurried out with the boy, Silas turned to Lila with an expression that brooked no argument. You're staying here where we can protect you. No going back to the boarding house until we know who these men are and what they want. Silas, you can't turn the schoolhouse into a fortress. The children will be safe because their teacher will be safe. He interrupted, moving to a cabinet where he'd begun storing supplies that had nothing to do with education. From it, he withdrew an old Colt revolver, its blue steel gleaming despite its age. Lila stared at the weapon with growing alarm. Where did that come from? It belonged to my father. He carried it during the war. Silas checked the cylinder with practiced efficiency. I haven't touched it in years, but I remember how to use it. Silas, no. Violence isn't the answer here. Sometimes. It's the only answer men like Hampton understand. His voice carried a hardness she'd never heard before, and she realized she was seeing a side of him that years of civilization and grief had buried but not eliminated. I won't let them hurt you, Lila, whatever it costs. The next few hours passed in tense watchfulness. Diego returned with 6 trusted men, all armed and positioned strategically around the schoolhouse. The strangers continued their inquiries, but kept their distance from the building itself, apparently aware that their presence had been noted and their intentions suspected not as evening approached. Sheriff Martinez arrived with a small posse of territorial marshals, their presence causing the strangers to quickly mount their horses and ride out of town. But the message of their visit was clear. Joshua Hampton's reach was long, and his willingness to resort to extra-legal methods was becoming evident. They'll be back, Sheriff Martinez said grimly as he briefed Silas and Lila on the situation. Hampton's political career is finished regardless, but if he's convicted on the federal charges, he's looking at decades in prison. Men facing that kind of time sometimes make desperate choices. What are you suggesting? Lila asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That you consider relocating until the trial. Somewhere safe, or Hampton's people can't find you. No. The word came from Lila with surprising force. I've run enough. This is my home now. These are my children, and this is my school. I won't be driven away by threats and intimidation. Silas felt his heart swell with admiration for her courage, even as his protective instincts screamed that she was making a dangerous choice. Then we make our stand here, he said simply. Together. That night, as Lila tried to rest in the small apartment attached to the schoolhouse, compromise that kept her close to protection while maintaining some privacy, she felt the first strong contraction. At first, she dismissed it as the false labor that had been troubling her for weeks. But as the pain intensified and developed a regular rhythm, she realized with a mixture of excitement and terror that her child had chosen this moment of maximum danger to make its entrance into the world. Silas, she called out, her voice tight with pain and effort. He appeared in her doorway immediately, still fully dressed despite the late hour. What is it? The baby, she gasped as another contraction gripped her. It's coming. For a moment, Silas simply stared at her, his mind struggling to process this new complication. Then his protective instincts kicked in, and he was moving with the purposeful efficiency that had made him successful in everything he'd ever attempted. Diego, he called, send someone for the doctor immediately. And get Mrs. Colton, she's helped with births before. As he helped Lila through the intensifying contractions, Silas found himself thinking about timing and vulnerability. Hampton's men were somewhere out there in the darkness, waiting for their opportunity. The doctor would have to travel from 3 towns over, a journey that would take hours in the best of circumstances. And here was Lila, at her most vulnerable moment, bringing new life into a world that seemed determined to destroy them both. Silas, Lila whispered between contractions, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. Promise me something. Anything. If something happens to me, if Hampton's people, promise me you'll make sure my child knows that everything I did out of love. Nothing's going to happen to you, he said fiercely, though his free hand moved unconsciously to where his father's gun rested in its holster. Not on my watch. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the new schoolhouse, and carrying with it the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose. In the distance, coyotes began to howl a wild, lonely sound that seemed to echo the danger gathering around them like a storm about to break. Silas squeezed Lila's hand and prepared to defend everything he'd learned to love against whatever darkness the night might bring. The hoofbeats grew closer as another contraction seized Lila, her cry of pain cutting through the night air like a blade. Silas positioned himself by the window, his father's revolver ready, while Diego's men took their positions around the schoolhouse. The timing couldn't have been worse, or perhaps, from Hampton's perspective, it couldn't have been better. How? Many riders? Silas called softly to Diego, who was crouched by the front entrance. 5, maybe 6. They've stopped at the edge of town, like they're planning something. Mrs. Colton arrived breathless and determined, pushing past the armed men with the authority of someone who'd been delivering babies since before most of them were born. She took one look at Lila's condition and began issuing orders with crisp efficiency. Get me clean water, towels, and a sharp knife. This baby's coming, whether we're ready or not. She turned to Silas with stern eyes. And you, young man, need to decide whether you're a guard or a midwife, because you can't be both. I'm not leaving her, Silas said firmly, though his attention remained split between the approaching danger and Lila's increasing distress. Then holster that weapon and help me. Birth is about bringing life into the world, not taking it out. Another contraction gripped Lila, stronger than before, as she reached for Silas's hand with desperate strength. Stay with me, she gasped. Please. The sound of approaching hoofbeats suddenly stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that made every man around the schoolhouse tense. Then Diego's voice cut through the night with urgent warning. They're dismounting, spreading out around the building. Silas found himself torn between two imperatives: protecting the woman he loved and helping her bring their future into the world. For in that moment of crystal clarity, brought by impending crisis, he understood that the child Lila carried might not be his by blood, but it would be his by choice, by love, by the commitment he was ready to make to both mother and child. Mrs. "Colton," he said quietly, "what do you need me to do?" "Hold her hand, keep her calm, and trust that I've brought more babies into this world than those men outside have taken lives out of it." The first gunshot shattered the night silence, followed immediately by Diego's shout of alarm. "They're trying to force the back door." Silas felt Lila's grip tighten on his hand as another contraction peaked, just as the sound of splintering wood announced that Hampton's men had gained entry to the building. The timing was devastating. The baby was coming now, whether the world was safe for it or not. "I can see the head," Mrs. Colton announced with grim satisfaction. "One more big push, dear girl." The sound of boots on wooden floors echoed through the schoolhouse as Hampton's hired guns moved through the main classroom toward the living quarters. Diego and his men had barricaded the front entrance, but the back door had proven vulnerable to determined assault. "Where is she?" A harsh voice demanded from the next room. "We know she's here." Silas drew his revolver with his free hand, never releasing Lila's grip with the other. The absurdity of the situation standing guard with a gun while his beloved labored to bring forth life struck him with surreal force. "Push, Lila," Mrs. Colton commanded. "Push now." The baby's cry filled the room just as the door to the living quarters burst open, revealing two hard-faced men with drawn weapons. For a heartbeat, everyone froze, the gunmen taking in the scene. Of new birth, Silas with his weapon trained on them, Mrs. Colton cradling a newborn infant still connected to its laboring mother. "Well, well," the lead gunman said with cold satisfaction. "Looks like we got here just in time. Hampton's going to be real pleased when we bring him both the woman and her bastard child." "You'll have to kill me first," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of a man who'd found something worth dying for. "That can be arranged." The gunman raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the room exploded into chaos. Diego burst through the window behind the gunman, his rifle speaking with deadly authority. Glass shattered, men shouted, and gunpowder smoke filled the air with acrid haze. Through it all, Mrs. Colton continued her work with unshakable focus, cutting the umbilical cord and wrapping the crying infant in cloth. "It's a girl," she announced with satisfaction, as if delivering babies during gunfights was perfectly routine. "And she's got good lungs." The firefight was brief but intense. Hampton's men, caught between Diego's assault from behind and Silas's position protecting Lila, found themselves outmaneuvered by defenders who knew the building's layout and had the motivation of protecting family. When the smoke cleared, 3 gunmen lay dead or wounded, while the other 2 had fled into the night. Silas holstered his weapon and turned to Lila, who was struggling to sit up despite her exhaustion. Her face was pale but determined, her eyes fixed on the small bundle Mrs. Colton was placing in her arms. "Is she?" Lila whispered, hardly daring to hope after such trauma. "Perfect," Mrs. Colton confirmed. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a cry that could wake the dead. "She's going to be a force to reckon with, this one." Lila looked down at her daughter's face, so small, so new, so completely innocent of the violence that had marked her entrance into the world. Then she looked up at Silas, who was kneeling beside the bed with an expression of wonder that transformed his weathered features. "Would you like to hold her?" Lila asked softly. Silas accepted the tiny bundle with the careful reverence of a man who understood he was being entrusted with something precious beyond measure. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but alert, and seemed to study his face with the serious concentration of someone taking the measure of the world she'd been born into. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to Dustcreek Hollow." Outside, the sound of approaching riders announced the arrival of Sheriff Martinez and his posse, drawn by the gunfire. The immediate danger was over, but Silas knew this was only the beginning. Hampton would send more men, make other attempts to eliminate the witness who threatened his freedom. But as he looked down at the child in his arms, innocent, trusting, completely dependent on the protection of adults who loved her, he felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't just about Lila anymore, or even about justice. This was about the future, about creating a world where children could grow up safe and educated and free to become whatever their hearts dreamed of being. "What will you name her?" he asked, Lila smiled, her face glowing with the exhausted triumph. "Of new motherhood. Hope," she said simply. "Her name is Hope." Mrs. Colton began cleaning up the evidence of birth with practiced efficiency, muttering under her breath about men who couldn't time their violence better. Diego appeared in the doorway, his rifle still ready but his face relieved. "The area's secure, Senator Silas. Sheriff Martinez is questioning the survivors. And the others who fled? They won't get far. The sheriff's men are tracking them." Diego's expression grew thoughtful as he looked at the newborn. "She chose quite a night to make her appearance, this little one. Perhaps she knew we needed something worth fighting for," Silas replied, still marveling at the tiny perfection of fingers and toes dot as the first light of dawn began to filter through the schoolhouse windows, illuminating the scene of chaos and miracle that had played out. In the space of a few hours, Lila felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the end of immediate danger and everything to do with the sense of belonging she'd found in this unlikely place. The schoolhouse around them bore the scars of battle-broken glass, splintered wood, the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air. But it also held something that no amount of violence could destroy, the love of people willing to stand together against whatever storms might come. And in her arms, Hope gurgled contentedly, apparently unaware that her first night in the world had been anything other than perfectly normal, which, Lila reflected with tired humor, was probably exactly as it should be. Children should be born, believing that the world was a place where people fought for what mattered, where communities protected their own, and where love was stronger than fear. The baby's cry had announced more than just her birth. It had proclaimed the triumph of life over death, hope over despair, and the enduring power of people willing to defend what they held dear. The dawn brought more than just the end of a harrowing night. It brought Sheriff Martinez with news that would change everything. The 2 gunmen who had fled were captured before they could leave the territory, and under interrogation, they revealed information that went far beyond a simple assassination attempt. "Hampton's finished," the sheriff announced as he stood in the schoolhouse's main classroom, surveying the damage from the night's violence. "The men we captured were carrying correspondence that implicates him in 3 other murders witnesses who might have testified against him. The federal prosecutors now have enough evidence to put him away for life, assuming he lives long enough to stand trial." Silas looked up from where he'd been sweeping broken glass, his movements careful to avoid disturbing Lila and the baby, who were resting in the apartment. "What do you mean, assuming he lives long enough?" Word reached St. Louis about his hired killer's failure here. Seems his business partners aren't pleased about the negative attention his schemes have brought to their operations. Men like Hampton have a way of becoming liabilities when their usefulness expires. The implication was clear. Joshua Hampton's own associates would likely eliminate him before he could implicate them in testimony. Justice would be served, but not necessarily through legal channels. "So it's over?" Diego asked, pausing in his work of boarding up the broken window. "For Miss Harper and the baby, yes. There's no reason for anyone to threaten them now. Hampton's finished, and his testimony is worthless, since he'll likely be dead within the month." Sheriff Martinez's expression grew thoughtful. "Though I suspect there might be other kinds of new beginnings on the horizon." He glanced meaningfully toward the apartment where Lila was recovering, then back at Silas, whose devotion during the crisis had been evident to everyone present. The sound of approaching voices interrupted their conversation. Through the intact windows, they could see the townspeople of Dustcreek Hollow gathering in the street, not with the hostile curiosity that had marked their previous encounters, but with the purposeful determination of a community rallying around its own. Mrs. Colton led the procession, carrying a large basket that smelled of fresh bread and soup. Behind her came the children: Tommy, Sarah, the twins, Mouse, little Pete, and all the others, their faces bright with excitement about meeting their teacher's new baby. And behind them walked nearly every adult in town, their arms full of gifts, supplies, and offerings of support. "Looks like word spread about last night," Sheriff Martinez observed with satisfaction. "Nothing builds community solidarity quite like surviving a crisis together." Mayor Polk appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his expression sheepish. Mr. Everhart, Miss ... Mrs. Well, whatever name she's using now, I wanted to apologize for my behavior regarding the wanted poster. The town council met this morning, and we'd like to formally express our gratitude for her service to our children and our regret for doubting her character. Perhaps you should express that to her directly, Silas suggested pointedly. Yes, of course. Is she... That is. Are mother and child well? Before Silas could answer, Lila appeared in the doorway to the apartment, moving slowly, but with obvious determination. She carried Hope in her arms, the baby swaddled in a quilt that the town women had stitched together during the long night of vigil. I'm well enough, Mayor Polk, she said with gentle dignity, and grateful for your concern. The mayor flushed with embarrassment and genuine remorse. Miss Harper, Miss Fern, I don't know what to call you. Call me what the children do. Miss Lila, that's who I am now, who I choose to be. The simple statement carried weight beyond its words. She was claiming her identity, her place in this community, her right to define herself rather than be defined by the accusations of others. Mrs. Colton bustled forward with maternal authority. Nonsense, dear. You should be resting, not entertaining visitors. I've been resting, and I want to see the children, to show them that their new classmate is healthy and strong. The children crowded around with the gentle excitement of young people meeting a newborn. Their questions came in a tumble of eager voices. Is she really going to come to school with us? What's her name? Can she already read? Does she know her letters yet? Lila laughed, the first genuine laughter anyone had heard from her since the ordeal began. Her name is Hope, and she attends school when she's old enough. But for now, she's going to help me teach by showing you all what it means to start fresh, to begin with nothing but possibility ahead of you. Tommy stepped forward with the serious expression he wore for important occasions. Miss Lila, we want you to know, all of us kids, that we're real sorry about folks doubting you. And we're glad you stayed to fight instead of running away. Yeah, added Sarah, running away don't solve nothing. We learned that from you. The simple wisdom of children, Silas reflected, often cut straight to the heart of complex adult situations. Lila had indeed taught them about standing ground, about fighting for what mattered, about choosing courage over safety. Speaking of not running away, Sheriff Martinez said with a meaningful look at Silas, there might be some other commitments worth considering now that the immediate danger has passed. The suggestion hung in the air like an invitation to step into the future they'd been building together. Silas felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to claim the happiness he'd never dared to hope for. Lila, he said, quietly, moving to stand beside her. There's something I've been wanting to ask you, but the timing never seemed right. The timing will never be perfect, she replied softly, looking down at Hope and then back at his face. But sometimes imperfect timing leads to perfect moments. Silas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the morning light streaming through the windows. Not a ring that would come later, with proper ceremony and preparation, but his mother's locket, the one that had contained Catherine's portrait, but which he'd emptied the night before, ready to fill with new memories, new love, new promises. Asking if you'll marry me, he said simply. Not because of the baby, not because of the danger we faced, but because I love you. Because I love the woman who saw potential where others saw problems, who chose courage when others chose judgment, who brought hope to a place that had forgotten what hope looked like. The schoolhouse fell silent, except for the sound of Hope's contented gurgling and the whisper of wind through the broken window. Every person present seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Lila's answer to a question that would determine not just two people's future, but the shape of the community they were all part of. Yes, Lila said, her voice clear and strong despite the tears in her eyes. Yes, because I love you too. Because you stood with me when others stood against me. Because you saw who I could be rather than who I had been. Because you helped me build something beautiful in this unlikely place. The sound that erupted from the assembled crowd was part cheer, part sigh of satisfaction, part celebration of love conquering adversity. Mrs. Colton began weeping openly. The children whooped with excitement. Even Sheriff Martinez smiled broadly. As he witnessed the transformation of crisis into triumph, Tommy stepped forward again, his young face serious with responsibility. "Miss Lila, does this mean Mr. Silas is going to be Hope's pa?" "If he wants to be," Lila replied, looking at Silas with eyes that held everything love, gratitude, and the promise of shared tomorrows. "I want to be," Silas said firmly, taking the baby from Lila's arms and holding her up so she could see the schoolhouse around them, the place where her mother had changed a community and where she herself would grow up surrounded by learning and love. "I want to be her father, your husband, and part of whatever future we build together in this place." Outside, the bell that had been ordered for the schoolhouse began to ring, Diego testing it in preparation for the official opening. It would now be delayed until Lila recovered from childbirth. But the sound seemed like a celebration, a call to something greater than education alone. It was a call to community, to commitment, to the understanding that sometimes the most unlikely places become home when they're filled with people willing to fight for love, for learning, for the chance to become better than they were before. And in that moment, with Hope gurgling contentedly in her chosen father's arms, and her mother glowing with happiness despite the night's ordeal, Dustcreek Hollow transformed from a dying town into something vibrant and full of promise, a place where children could learn, families could flourish, and love could triumph over the longest odds. 6 months later, the Dustcreek Hollow School stood as more than just a building. It had become the beating heart of a community transformed. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been repaired and expanded, illuminating 2 classrooms full of eager young faces bent over their lessons. What had begun with one pregnant woman teaching letters in a dusty barn had grown into an institution that drew families from 3 counties away, all seeking the quality education that had become Dustcreek Hollow's unexpected claim to fame. Lila now, Mrs. Silas Everhart, moved between the younger and older, students with the confident grace of someone who had found her true calling. At her side, baby Hope slept peacefully in a cradle that Silas had crafted from oak grown on his own land, her presence a living reminder of how new beginnings could emerge from the most challenging circumstances. "Mrs. Everhart," called out young Emma, now 8 years old, and reading at a level that would have impressed educators in much larger cities. "I finished my composition about the town's history. Would you like to hear it? Please, Emma, share it with all of us." Emma stood with the poise that good teaching had instilled in her and began to read. Dustcreek Hollow used to be a place where people came to disappear. But then Miss Lila came here, and instead of disappearing, she helped us all appear. She taught us that learning isn't just about books. It's about becoming who we're meant to be. The simple wisdom of the child's words brought tears to Lila's eyes. These children, who had once run wild through empty streets, now spoke with eloquence about concepts that many adults struggled to grasp. More importantly, they carried themselves with the confidence that came from knowing they were valued, educated, and prepared for whatever future they chose to pursue. "That's beautiful, Emma. Who else would like to share their work?" Tommy, now 11 and serving as an informal teaching assistant for the younger children, raised his hand. "I wrote about mathematics and ranching, using the things Mr. Silas taught us about calculating feed costs and market prices." As Tommy launched into his presentation, Lila found her attention momentarily drawn to the window, where she could see Silas working with Diego to expand the school's garden. The sight of her husband, the words still sent warmth through her chest. Even after 6 months of marriage, carefully tending vegetables that would feed the children brought her the same quiet joy that had marked every day since their wedding. Ceremony had been held in the schoolhouse itself, with Sheriff Martinez officiating and the entire town in attendance. It had been simple but profound, uniting not just 2 people, but symbolically joining all the threads that had woven Dustcreek Hollow into a genuine community. Mrs. Colton had wept through the entire service, proclaiming it the most romantic thing she'd seen in 60 years of living. "Mrs. Everhart?" Sarah's voice brought Lila back to the present. Now 13 and showing remarkable aptitude for teaching, Sarah had begun helping with the younger children during her free periods. "The afternoon reading group is ready to begin." "Thank you, Sarah. Why don't you take the lead today? I'll observe and assist as needed." Watching Sarah guide 6-year-old Pete through his first attempts at reading complete sentences, Lila reflected on how far they'd all come. The girl who had once been forced to grow up too quickly was now channeling her maturity into nurturing others, while the boy who could barely write his name was tackling stories that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The door. Chime, a gift from a grateful parent whose daughter had learned to read despite a learning disability, announced a visitor. Lila looked up to see a familiar figure in the doorway, a well-dressed woman in traveling clothes, her face bearing the kind of refined features that spoke of education and privilege. "Elizabeth?" The woman called out, her voice filled with emotion. "Oh, my dear Elizabeth, I've found you at last." Lila's hands flew to her throat as recognition dawned. "Margaret's sister, Catherine Whitfield, what are you doing here?" "I've come to deliver news, and to see for myself the life you've built." Catherine's eyes swept the classroom, taking in the eager faces, the well-organized learning materials, the obvious atmosphere of educational excellence. "The trial is over, Elizabeth. Joshua Hampton was convicted on all charges: embezzlement, conspiracy, and 3 counts of murder. He'll spend the rest of his life in federal prison." The news brought a profound sense of closure that Lila hadn't realized she still needed. "And the other charges? The ones against me?" "Completely dismissed. Your name has been officially cleared, and Joshua's business associates have made ... arrangements to compensate you for the suffering their partner caused." Catherine handed her a legal document. "There's a substantial settlement, Elizabeth. Enough to secure your future and expand your school if you choose." Lila stared at the papers with amazement. The amount was significant enough to transform the school from a local institution into something that could serve the entire territory. But more than the money, it was the official vindication that mattered. Legal acknowledgement that she had been wronged rather than wrongdoing. "There's something else," Catherine continued, glancing around the classroom with obvious approval. "The Territorial Education Board has heard about your work here. They're offering you a position overseeing teacher training for the entire New Mexico territory. It would mean traveling, speaking at conferences, helping establish schools throughout the region." The offer was generous, prestigious, and exactly the kind of recognition that Lila's work deserved. It was also impossible to accept. "I'm honored by the offer," she said gently, "but my place is here. These children, this community, they're my calling. What we've built together is too precious to abandon for career advancement." Catherine nodded with understanding. "I thought you might say that. My sister always said you had the rare gift of knowing what truly mattered." She paused, studying Hope, who had awakened and was gazing at the world with the alert curiosity that seemed to characterize her personality. "And this beautiful child? She's thriving?" "She's perfect," Lila replied, lifting Hope from her cradle. "She's surrounded by love, by learning, by a community that sees her as a gift rather than a burden. As it should be." Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. "Elizabeth, what if I told you there was a way to expand your impact without leaving Dustcreek Hollow? What if instead of going to other schools, we brought other teachers here?" The idea that began to take shape over the next hour was ambitious, beyond anything Lila had dared imagine. Using the settlement money as seed funding, they could establish Dustcreek Hollow as a teacher training institute, a place where educators from across the territories could come to learn the methods that had proven so successful with these children. The original school would continue serving local students, but it would also become a model for educational excellence throughout the region. When Silas arrived for his customary afternoon visit, he found his wife deep in planning sessions with Catherine and several newly arrived officials from the territorial government. The sight of Lila's animated engagement with ideas that could reshape education across the Southwest filled him with the same pride he'd felt on their wedding day. "You've set something magnificent in motion," he murmured during a quiet moment, watching Hope sleep peacefully despite the excited planning happening around her cradle. "We've set it in motion," Lila corrected, taking his hand. "None of this would have been possible without your support, your protection, your belief in what we were building together." As the sun set over Dustcreek Hollow, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, the little town that had once been dying was now buzzing with the energy of expansion and possibility. Children's laughter echoed from the playground that community volunteers had built behind the school. Families gathered for evening meals, discussing their children's progress and their own dreams for the future. And in the schoolhouse, plans were taking shape that would touch thousands of lives across the territories. The marriage certificate that hung framed on the wall of Silas and Lila's home wasn't just a legal document, it was a symbol of transformation. Two wounded people had found healing in shared purpose. A dying town had discovered new life through education and community. Children who had been forgotten were now being prepared to lead, but most profoundly, it represented the truth that hope, once planted and nurtured with love, could grow beyond anyone's wildest expectations. What had begun with a pregnant woman teaching letters to barefoot children in a dusty barn had become something that would endure for generations, a legacy of learning, love, and the enduring power of people who choose to see possibility where others see only problems. As Lila sat in her rocking chair that evening, nursing hope while Silas read aloud from the book of poetry they'd been sharing, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The pain of her past had not disappeared, it had been transformed into wisdom. The fear that had driven her to flee had become the courage to stand and fight for what mattered. Outside their window, the lights of Dustcreek Hollow twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family touched by education, a child prepared for a brighter future, a community that had learned the difference between surviving and thriving. And in her arms, hope gurgled contentedly, already surrounded by the books and learning materials that would shape her education, already beloved by a father who had chosen love over biology, already part of the story that proved redemption was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. The pregnant woman who had once taught reading to forgotten children had become the founder of an educational legacy that would outlast them all. And in the end, that seemed exactly as it should be. For the greatest lessons are always about what we pass on to those who come after us, and the hope we nurture in young hearts hungry for the chance to become more than anyone ever thought possible.